let me introduce our first presenter representing the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. We have Mr. Buwanekabahu Perera, Secretary General, CEO, and Mr. Shiran Fernando, the Chief Economist. I'll invite Mr. Buwanekabahu Perera to start the presentation and then pass it on to Mr. Shiran Fernando. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Good morning to all of you. Honorable Minister, Mr. Buwanekabahu, thank you very much for that opening remarks that you made. It's very challenging. It's quite a task taken upon you, initiative taken upon you, which was outdated for a long time, the labor laws which have been outdated for a long time, which you are trying to amalgamate or refine, or whatever the way it may be, to adapt it to a climate that is suited for this country and to take it forward. It is not an easy task. For us, as outsiders, it may be very easy to criticize or to support, but a person for a minister to take this forward against many challenges that may be coming from all sides is not that easy. The route what you have taken, or the journey what you have taken for the ultimate goal to refine this, you have taken a route that is to consult everybody and get their views and finally to amalgamate and change it. The request that we make is to make that route as short as possible. To the same destination, you can take many routes, like when you look at Google Maps, they will direct you many routes to take, but try to take the shortest route that you can, so that we don't have to wait for another 2 or 3 years to see this as a reality. Second, thank you very much for inviting the Chamber, Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, to make the presentations. Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, with many decades, more than 100 years of history, represents a fair cross-section of the private sector. And in this exercise, thank you very much for inviting us to present their views on this. And for that purpose, I will invite my colleague, Mr. Shiran Fernando, who is the Chief Economist of the Ceylon Chamber. Thank you.
Thank you, Buwaneka. Good morning to everyone. Thank you, Minister, for this opportunity, to members of the Ministry, the Labour Commission, and to fellow members in the private sector, trade unions. A very good morning. So I won't take too much of your time, and I also watched last week's presentation, so I think some of this might be a little bit of a repetition, but I think it's good to enforce the case once more. So there are 6 points that we want to bring across in the next few minutes. The first being the case for labor reform. I think as the Minister and also the previous speaker mentioned, why we are in this position, we can think of some of the missteps, the policy missteps we've taken in the last few years. But if you look at it from a 4 to 5 decade perspective, it's really, we haven't driven exports and we haven't driven FDI. And whatever studies you look at from the World Bank to even local studies here, they identify what you call binding constraints, or constraints to growth and trade and investment. And the top on those are labor and land, and of course other factors related to trade, tariffs and things like that. So while we are in this IMF program, we will only get the macro stability part, which will help us in the next 1 to 2 years. What will carry us forward is doing these difficult reforms, because we need to sustain it, because we can't afford to come back to the IMF in 3 to 4 years' time for our 18th program, because we haven't driven FDI up, we haven't got our exports. So I think it's a very opportune moment that the government is looking at, I would say, IMF plus reforms, and the plus being things that we ourselves want to do. On land, I think the President has highlighted some things that he wants to discuss. Maybe the private sector will be given an opportunity there. And on labor, we are seeing this forum. And on the trade side, on the tariffs and things like that, we're also seeing some developments to which we're giving our input as well. So why do we need labor reform? So I think a lot of evidence, a lot of studies have been done. And one of the key things that we do at the Chamber, Buwaneka, myself, and a lot of our colleagues, is we meet foreign investors. And they have many options. Sri Lanka is not the only option for investment. And people ask, why do investors go to Vietnam? Why do investors go to Southeast Asia and a lot of these countries? One of the issues is, of course, land. The other issue is labor. A lot of the complexities around it. And here, this is something that is updated every year. So when investors are thinking of Sri Lanka, they'll go to these websites where a lot of the foreign embassies put out their assessment of the investment climate. And clearly, it highlights that while we have a good talent pool, it is difficult to harness at scale, and a lot of the constraints are there, which we will get into. One of the ways FDI can go up, because if you look at the last 40 years, the 4 decades, we've only got about 20 billion in FDI. And if you look at that 20 billion, maybe 4-5 billion is on the telecom side, which is more infrastructure spending. So really not spending towards something that will create an export of services. And the remaining has been 2 traditional sectors, apparel, and then we've seen real estate. And as the minister mentioned, a lot of the real estate investment that came in was driven by foreign talent in a space where hiring foreign talent, there's a lot of opaqueness. So can we get, if you look at countries like Vietnam, they hit 5 billion on average, US dollars 5 billion on average in terms of investment. Where is that missing link? And I think labor is one of the components towards this, because investors now look for a plug and play. They want to see the land, they want to see the water coming in, the electricity, the cost of that. They want to be able to see whether they can get labor within the region. They want to see whether maybe in particular positions, whether they can bring in foreign talent that will help the local talent, and so on. So I think this has been clearly highlighted, and if we continue to say that we are only getting 1 billion in FDI going forward, I'm sure in a few years' time we'll be going back to the IMF, because we haven't done some of the other reform that is really required. So this is the case for labor reform. There is a need for harmonizing of labor reforms, labor laws. I think there is several that I've outlined here. Of course, there are many others that come into it as well. I think it's difficult to, depending on the timescale that the ministry is looking at for reform, whether you go for one piece of legislation or something in the intermediate and then build on that and develop something more concrete. I think that is purely up to the timelines, because we need to develop things, we need to move fast, and we need to, we are catching up basically in a lot of these laws. And I think there's a lot of studies that have been put out, a lot of research. I think ILO and so many other institutions have put out reports, I think 4 or 5 years back as well. So we don't need to sometimes even reinvent the wheel. We just need to relook at it, use this forum as a validation, and then look at the legislation as well. Then when we look at something like TEVA, I think this is, when we asked our members, these are inputs not of my own or our CEO, but inputs that we got from our chamber committees on legislation, on people development, and on economic policy. And I think TEVA came out as one of the key issues. It's not that the private sector has any issues with the formula or how it is paid, but really the burden process and the time-consuming process and the scope. I think those are the key areas. So here we would leave some input in terms of expanding the scope to consider performance-related measures, redundancy, because right now a lot of businesses are struggling. 2 issues that businesses right now are facing, of course, are the high interest rates and the outward migration of labor. But in this global economy, which is slowing down, a lot of businesses are also struggling to find new orders coming in. So there might be room for them to right-size or downsize or whatever we want to call it. But that flexibility in labor is not there, and a lot of these businesses, they'll struggle to move forward. I think the screen went off. Yeah, thanks. And with this, what we also recommend is something like an unemployment insurance, which I think the minister mentioned. We see that if you look at South Korea, if you look at Malaysia, if you look at Vietnam, all of them have some form of this. Whether it's not only to help employees when they're out of labor, but to also reskill them. I think that's the key thing. I think we have to get out of that mentality that I'm going to be in this job forever. There are other jobs that will come in when you're 20 years, 30 years on. And I think that's the mentality that we need to get our employers and as well as our employees into the thinking as well. So I think we need to design that well. Separate to that, I know there is work on the trade reform, and we are thinking of a trade adjustment package. I think we were talking about this when the current president was prime minister in 2017-18. Even at that point, we gave a lot of input to it. So that conversation also needs to happen with this ministry and maybe the trade ministry, whoever is going to run the trade adjustment program as well. My fourth point is on the participation of women in the labor force. I know you can't see my points, but I think this is where we are really behind a lot of countries. Historically, we've always said we have a low female participation that was 34-35%. But if you look at the last few quarters or even the last few years, now that is down to about 30-31%. So the pandemic, the economic crisis is really pushing more out of the labor force. When in this period of high expenditure and things like that, we need to have more women coming into the labor force. And a lot of companies are looking at that. A lot of companies, a lot of multinationals, a lot of investors are looking at a diversity angle much more, the diversity and inclusion angle much more, and that is why Sri Lanka needs to position itself as a center for having greater gender balance in the workforce and greater women working in the workforce and as well. And it's also, I think, the statistics show those who exit the university system, a majority of them are females, but unfortunately, 4 or 5 years down the line in the labor force, they don't really continue. Multitude of factors, transport, the cultural barriers, all of that, but one of the key issues is the labor law and I think enabling night work and things like that, because there's a lot of ambiguity. I was sitting next to the lady from the women's chamber as well, and there are a lot of things that they have proposed, and they are not sure whether they are implemented, because it's only certain sectors that are able to, or certain companies that are right now able to have night care work, given that they meet the criteria. So I think there's a lot that we need to do. We've had a lot of budgets talking about childcare facilities. I think when that came out in the 2017-2018 budget, I think under late Finance Minister Mangal Samaraweera, the private sector got excited about maybe organizing crashes and things like that, but we didn't see something beyond that. We didn't see what the structure will be, how this thing. So I think we need to think through some of these things, because those are factors, whether we like it or not, that are deterrents to greater female participation. And I'm sure when the Women's Chamber also comes and makes a presentation, a lot of these will be talked about as well. So I think this is the fourth point that I would like to leave you with. The fifth point is really incorporating new ways of work. I think the world was working in this new way of work. I think Sri Lanka really transitioned into it because of COVID, one of the blessings in disguise in that sense. But I think we need to be able to attract some of these talent, because sometimes maybe in certain skills, which is more creative in nature, sometimes they don't really need to come into a four-walled office. Maybe they can work in the comfort of their home. Maybe they're more creative at 3 o'clock in the morning rather than at 9:30 in the morning. So I think we need to, that's where the creative economy in Sri Lanka also needs to be recognized, and those new ways of work needs to to come into the law as well. And I think it's important, Minister, and when we are thinking of this reform and way forward, that we bring the process more digital as well. We can't have, manual forms coming in and out, even at the ministerial level or even at the private sector level. Of course, private sector will also have to change their ways. So I think it's important to bring in those technology thinking, at least at this stage, to see how we can bring it, because that will bring savings. At the end of the day, we want to bring down, as much as the private sector is paying taxes, Minister, we want to see expenditure but the government also coming down. And I think we need to find, every rupee matters in this sense, and finding ways to reduce it, I think, will be important. The final point is really attracting foreign talent. I think this is a key issue that a lot of our members find, because there is a lot of talent within Sri Lanka, but there are certain positions, maybe a lot of newer sectors, that they need maybe a foreign talent to come in, to be able to provide that experience, provide that training for local talent to then come up as well. So I think this is where the whole mechanism, I know the Labour Ministry has to coordinate with the Immigration Department as well, so I think those need to happen, but we don't want a situation where someone has to go from pillar to post, get approval processes and sort it out, and in the end, the person living overseas doesn't really want to come here. And this is also a great opportunity to get back expat workers, because right now you're having a lot of good talent leaving Sri Lanka, and I think what we'll have in about 4 or 5 years is a missing middle, because a lot of the middle of a lot of our private sector companies are migrating. But if the economy does better, things are getting much better, they might want to come back and give to Sri Lanka. And I think that's where, if you learn from India, India also went through an economic crisis in 1991. What drove them, of course, they opened up the economy, did a lot of reform, but a lot of the expats in the US came back and gave to the country. And that environment was ripe. So some of these expats might go overseas, they might marry, someone from that region, so they might want to come back, but they might not want to bring the spouse and the children, because the labor laws are not conducive if it continues like this. So I think we need to think of ways to make that much more easier, especially for spousal visa. I think there's a lot of foreigners that we meet that say, we love Sri Lanka, we want to stay, and we don't want to go back. We need to keep some of them in the economy and let them, I think you have that in Singapore and other countries where it's so easy for us, for example, to go to another country and work, but when we want to invite them to come here, it's so difficult. So I think we must rethink those. So I think a lot of that needs to happen. Maybe it doesn't have to be legislation in a law. It could even be regulation that is inhibiting it. Maybe processes, even could be agreements between this ministry and the immigration ministry. So those are at a broad level. I think we will communicate a lot of our views through the chamber and of course the EFC, who we work very closely with. I think we will send you detailed submission as well, Minister. And we, as Buwaneka mentioned, we thank you for this opportunity and look forward to engaging with you. And we hope that this model will be taken to other ministries as well for consultation for reform, because it's good to have an inclusive process rather than presenting something and then fighting back towards it. So thank you so much.